Hello there. This will be my fourth video of the Break the Caro-Kann series. The goal of the series is to analyze some games featuring the Caro-Kann and hopefully to gather some ideas to help you deal with the Caro-Kann over the board. The following game was played by Nigel Short as white and none other than the former world champion Boris Spassky playing as black, the Caro-Kann. The following game was played in 2001, so it was not at Boris Spassky's peak, but at the time he had a ranking of over 2500, so he was still quite a strong player. Let's see how this went. e4, c6, d4, d5, e5. So the Caro-Kann advanced variation. We've got g6 here, an unusual move. Most players would move the white squared bishop out of the pawn chain. However, fianchettoing the bishop to g7 indicates that black will try to undermine white's pawn center immediately. We've got c4 striking at black's d-pawn, black's center, hoping to develop the bishop with tempo. Bishop to g7 as planned, knight to c3, knight to h6, which is an awkward but quite logical choice. We don't want to play e6 yet, while the white squared bishop is still undeveloped. h3, preventing bishop to g4, castles, knight to f3, f6, attacking the pawn center finally. Bishop to e2, we've got finally the short setup in the Caro-Kann, but quite delayed in this case. Knight to f7 forces white to exchange the e-pawn, and e takes f6. Taking with the pawn gives black better pawn structure, but the black fianchettoed bishop is very passive. Of course, taking with the bishop was also an option. Here we've got castles by white on move 10, and as we can see, white is much better developed and has two pawns in the center. Its pieces are way more active. We generally don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, as black did with their knight. We may never get the precious tempo back. We've got bishop to e6 supporting the d-pawn. The d-pawn may well fall or become isolated. For example, if rook goes to the open file immediately, then we've got a triple attack on the d-pawn. There is also an option that c takes d, and queen to b3 anyway, so we want to watch out for that. Anyway, the queen goes to b3 either way, because the white squared bishop left the b7 square unprotected. Queen to d7 protecting, rook to e1, and as we can see, the development advantage and queen coming out with a tempo let white take the open file with the rook first. Knight to d6, provoking finally c5, and getting ready to jump to f5. Once c5 is on the board, d4 may be a weakness targeted by the dark squared bishop of black. We've got c5, knight to f5, very good square, and bishop to f4. Once the knight on f5 is gone, d6 will be a great outpost for the bishop. g5 chasing away the bishop, bishop to h2, h5 by black, getting some space advantage. As we can see, the computer does not like opening the black king that much. Bishop to d3, attacking the knight on f5, g4, very brave move, h takes g, and bishop takes f5. We've got the exchange here, taking off the board the very strong knight, and here we've got improvement of the white knight to h4, chasing away the bishop. The white squared bishop goes to h7, and black retains the pair of bishops. but the black bishop is just a pawn in this position, and white bishop seems active but is not looking at any squares white may care about. We've got bishop to d6 as expected, rook to f7 avoiding the attack, rook to e2 preparing to double up, knight to a6, finally some development here, rook a to e1 doubling up, bishop to f8. The bishop on d6 is too strong to be left there. We've got bishop to f8, bishop taking f8, trying to maintain the pawn chain as long as possible, and eliminating black's dark squared bishop finally. d4 is not going to be a weakness in this position as much as it was a few moves ago. Rook a takes f5. Taking with the king would not be safe because of the heavy pieces still being on the board. If the rook takes, but the rooks are doubled up on a wrong file. The open file is taken by the white rooks here. We've got g3, stopping g3 from black. It could have opened the white's king to some nasty attacks. b6 finally attacking the pawn chain, c takes b, and queen takes b7. Actually the best way in this position to play for the black would be to give up a pawn. However, it would lead obviously to exchange of queens, and this will greatly blunt all the threats that white has in this position. Queen back to d1, getting ready to maybe take on g4. Also, taking the additional pawn was not an option. The queen trade would not give white as many chances here. A takes b and rook to e6. Very aggressive, decisive move, because it's attacking g4 from discovery, but also invading black's territory very powerfully. We've got rook to g7, protecting the g pawn, and a3. Here it prevents knight to b4, and from b4 knight would be able to go to d3 or to c2, which squares would be very active and aggressive. These would be very nice squares for that knight. We don't want that. However, this move is not the best in the position. The best move in the position would be rook to d6, and it would force the knight back. The other rook of white is coming to e6, threatening the pawn on f6, and the knight has to move back in this position, which also prevents it from going more active to d3 or c2. However, here we've got queen to d7, rook comes back to d3, knight to c7. The knight was pretty much miserable on the a file. Here it may seem a bit more active, protecting the e6. Here we've got queen to b3, answered with b5. The pawn cannot be taken, but now queen to b4, getting better control of e7, a very important square to which all the heavy pieces are directed. We've got rook to e8, getting ready to maybe exchange. a4 here, rook takes e3, rook takes e3, knight to e6, getting a bit more active, closing the file. A takes b5, and here Spassky blunders because there are really no active moves. The best move for black would be to take the b pawn and lose it, and lose the c pawn, but still keep white's pawns far from the action, far from the queening squares. Actually, the computer suggests here c takes d, knight takes bishop to e4, a very nice square, and then exchanges on this square, and then rook to f7, hopefully maybe to break with the f pawn, maybe gaining some initiative later, right? The other moves that the computer suggests are actually rook to f7 right away, or king to h8, which is a very passive move. But as we can see, Spassky played c5 here. He wanted to play active and try to go for a bit of a tactic here. So d takes c5 and d4, forking the rook and the knight. However, here we've got c6, attacking the queen right away. Probably Spassky did not consider this move, and this precious tempo on the king, on the queen, makes the pawn fall quite useless. Here we've got queen to c8, still protecting the knight, but rook takes e6. The pawns on b and c file are so close to the action that we can afford to sacrifice an exchange. Queen takes e6, rook takes d4, all the white's pawns are eaten. White may be down in exchange, but for 3 pawns, and one of which, the c pawn, is quite close to promotion. So rook goes to e7, doubling up. c7, taking with the rook, loses, of course, the rook due to this check. b6 supporting the pawn quite forever. Rook to d7, attacking chasing away the queen, but it doesn't matter that much, because the queen goes to e3, offering exchange of queens. It will be quite fine for white to exchange queens now, because white is about to promote the c pawn to another queen. We've got queen to c6, queen to h6 by short, king to g8, retreating, knight to g6, checkmate on f8 is threatened, so black has to deal with it. Rook to f7, and finally, after knight to d5, black resigns, because we've got a threat to fork queen and king from the e7 square. If black rook would take on e7, then we've got checkmate on f8. Taking the knight is also not an option, because we've got potential to get another queen on c8. Another variation that would prolong the game would be for the bishop to take on g6, but here we've got queen takes g6, king to f8, and from here the queening square is protected. Also the knight is protected, so queen to c1, queen to g2, and there is absolutely nothing that can be done here. So the lesson for today: take good care of your weaknesses. White gave black the obvious plan of attacking an isolated pawn, but left it with nothing to attack with. The d-pawn actually decided the game by taking the c-pawn and promoting to a queen. The black squared bishop, the natural attacker of the d4 square, was eliminated, and all the weaknesses in white's position were taken care of. So quite an instructive game, if you ask me, and that's all for today. Thank you very much.